The private jet was shaking so badly that it seemed like it wasn't a plane at all, but rather some cardboard toy. The weather was getting worse, the gusts of wind were getting stronger, and the snowfall was getting heavier. The unfortunate passengers were cursing themselves for having decided to go on this risky journey. But they did it for the sake of their business, which often pushes people to make rash decisions. There were 4 passengers on the plane and 1 pilot. There was the owner of the company, Alfred Douglas, his assistant, Melanie White, and a young IT specialist, Jacob. The 4th passenger on the plane was an elderly man who had nothing to do with the firm or the business world. The old man's name was Charles Hall, and he had recently celebrated his 80th birthday. Out of all the passengers, he was the only one who didn't seem all that fazed by what was happening. Charles looked out the window with the calmness of a yoga master whose soul had already found balance. Despite the fact that the pilot was doing everything he could, nature seemed to be winning that game. An exceptionally strong gust of wind changed the flight path of the aircraft, after which the pilot lost control of it. Falling into the thick and snow-covered forest, the plane groaned like a wounded animal, threatening to split into hundreds of mangled pieces upon contact with the ground. Fortunately, that didn't happen. The fall of the aircraft was softened by the branches of huge fir trees, which played the role of a natural shock absorber. The first one to come to his senses was Alfred. He made his way into the cockpit and saw that the pilot was dead. That definitely isn't good, Charles drawled disappointedly. Deep down, he was still hoping that they would be able to lift the plane into the sky somehow. But now, his last hopes had shattered. After a small roll call, it turned out that all of the other passengers were alive. Judging by the characteristic terrain, they crashed over the forests of Wyoming, which stretch for many miles along the entire state. "I think we need to go out and look for help. Staying here won't get us anywhere," Alfred said, as if he was a seasoned tourist. Melanie immediately agreed with him, but Jacob had some doubts. "I'm sure they will go searching for the plane as soon as the storm subsides. They will launch a search operation, so I think it's best to stay put." Alfred grimaced in displeasure. His authority in the company was indisputable, but now some IT guy dared to disagree with him. Meanwhile, Charles Hall sat quietly in the corner and remained neutral. The old man knew that the weather would alter any human plan, so they needed to wait a day or 2 before going anywhere. But Alfred thought otherwise. The man wanted to get out of the plane as soon as possible and go looking for civilization. Unfortunately, none of the passengers knew their exact locations, which made the task at hand very challenging. Having barely managed to open the door that got mangled during the fall, Alfred climbed out of the plane. The blizzard had almost stopped, surrendering to the terrible cold, which caused severe discomfort to the agitated people who just experienced the terrifying fall. Alfred turned to Melanie and Jacob and said, "We need to leave the old man here. He won't be able to walk far in this weather, and we'll end up having to drag him all the way." Melanie nodded in agreement and showed her willingness to follow her boss wherever he leads. But Jacob hesitated. He didn't want to leave the elderly man to the mercy of fate, especially since Charles seemed to be the most reasonable person present. "I won't leave Mr. Hall alone. If you want, you can go ahead, but I'm staying here," the young IT specialist declared. Alfred thought for a moment. He felt offended by the young man's answer. He also understood that going into the wild without the young and strong Jacob would make things harder for Alfred. He knew he couldn't really count on Melanie, since all she was capable of doing was making coffee back at the office. "All right, have it your way. Let's take the old man with us. But if he gets tired and can't walk, you'll be the one to carry him." Alfred changed his mind. Mr. Hall smiled and looked at Jacob gratefully. The old man was relieved that he didn't get left alone in the middle of the snowy forest. Making their way through the snowdrifts was very difficult, especially given that they reached 2 or more feet in some places. Jacob led the way. Being younger and stronger than the other men, it was easier for him to make a path in the snow. They walked for about 2 miles, but didn't see any traces of civilization. Melanie was the first one to start complaining. She was too tired to continue making her way through the thick snow and the trees felled by the storm. Charles Hall walked in silence and didn't show how tired he was. Given his extensive life experience, the old man initially knew that their mission was doomed to fail. Charles tried to conserve his energy, but he knew that in about half an hour he wouldn't be able to continue walking. Alfred squinted at the old man with undisguised contempt, after which he suggested abandoning him yet again. Jacob looked sadly at Mr. Hall and saw the silent approval in his eyes. The old man seemed to be saying, "Go on, kid, it's fine. I'll be okay." Jacob gave Mr. Hall a nod and made the difficult decision. However, before leaving the old man, Jacob found a suitable place for him to hide. It was a small hollow in the rock, which the young man covered with fir branches. "We'll come back for you, Mr. Hall, I promise," Jacob assured the old man. Alfred chuckled and shook his head. If they were to successfully find people, the businessman wasn't planning on returning for Mr. Hall. He believed that the old man had lived a long enough life and could well find his demise in the snowy forest of Wyoming. Jacob continued going forward, stopping once in a while to make small cuts in the bark of the trees with his penknife. That way, they would be able to find their way back to Mr. Hall, as well as the site of the plane crash. Tired and wet, the passengers walked for about a mile more until they saw a small column of smoke that billowed over the tops of the trees. "There must be someone living there. Do you see that?" Jacob exclaimed and rushed forward, having gathered the rest of his strength. Alfred didn't lag behind, but Melanie was completely exhausted and was having a very hard time keeping up with the men. Soon they saw a small hut in front of them, which looked like a house from a fairy tale. As Jacob approached the cabin, the door creaked open and an elderly man with a bushy beard and a lush mustache appeared in front of them. The man was holding a gun in his right hand, although he had it lowered for safety reasons. "Sir, our plane crashed a few hours ago. We need help, food, and clothes." Alfred was the first one to speak up. The old man nodded in understanding, after which he silently gestured for the guests to come inside. Once in the safety of the warm hut, the tired travelers relaxed noticeably and felt much, much better. Lounging in the owner's chair, Alfred felt like the master of the universe once again. The bossy notes in the businessman's voice made it clear that all the man wanted to do was be back in his office and back to bossing people around as soon as possible. Melanie was drinking tea and mentally thanking God for sending them help. Jacob was the only one who clearly felt uncomfortable. The young man felt agitated over the fate of Mr. Hall, and also because the face of the cabin's owner seemed vaguely familiar. He couldn't figure out who the man reminded him of because his beard covered most of his face. As it turned out from the conversation, the name of the reserved owner of the house was Donald. He spent the last 20 years of his life in the forest, having voluntarily become a hermit. Local hunters tried to help the old man out with food and household items, which they left for him around the forest. In return, Donald gave them finely tanned skins and varnished woodcrafts. The old man didn't have a family. He spent his childhood and youth in dark alleys that served as a shelter for teenage gangs. Donald had to go through a lot before he ended up in the forest hut. There was love, problems with the law, and subsequent persecution caused by the unwillingness of other people to live next to a former criminal. It was then that Donald decided to go into the forest. There, unlike in the big city, life was clear and simple. Having deprived himself of all temptations, the man became a forest hermit who lived one day at a time. When Jacob told Donald about the fourth survivor of the plane crash, the old man immediately volunteered to help. Since Alfred and Melanie refused to go back for Charles, Jacob and Donald went together. Seeing the notches Jacob left on the trees, Donald praised him for his quick wit and natural ingenuity. Thanks to the previously trodden path, the men got to Charles rather quickly. Having peeked out from his makeshift hiding place, Charles Hall saw Jacob and waved his arms gleefully. Frankly speaking, he had some doubts that his brothers in misfortune would actually come back for him. But when Donald came closer, he suddenly grabbed his head and fell to his knees. Unable to understand what was happening, Jacob ran up to the old man. He touched Donald on his shoulder and asked if he was all right. Tears were streaming down Donald's face, freezing immediately on his cold cheeks. It wasn't until Jacob looked over at Charles that he realized what had been bothering him all this time. Charles and Donald looked exactly the same. It was only the hermit's beard that kept Jacob from realizing it sooner. "So what, are you two brothers?" Jacob exclaimed. Charles nodded to confirm Jacob's suspicions. He was also crying, just like his twin brother, and he wasn't even trying to hide it. It was only when the brothers hugged and calmed down a bit that they finally could explain what was going on. Many years ago, when they were 7 years old, Charles and Donald took their father's boat and went fishing on the river. The twin brothers were laughing contagiously, rejoicing at their ingenuity, and didn't even notice when they sailed a long distance from the coast. Suddenly, a strong wind arose, which started throwing the boat on the waves as if it was some kind of a feather. That was when Donald fell overboard. Everything happened so quickly that Charles couldn't even attempt to help him. Caught up in the stormy stream, Donald got carried down the river. Charles struggled with the elements for several hours, unable to reach the shore, and only thanks to the rescuers who arrived in a motorboat did the boy manage to survive. Despite extensive searches, Donald's body was never found. All this time, Charles lived with the idea that he was indirectly responsible for the death of his brother. According to Donald, the current carried him many miles downstream of the river. What saved the boy from imminent death was the trunk of an old tree that was knocked down by a hurricane. Having wrapped his arms around the log, Donald kept floating until the current washed him ashore. Fortunately, the boy lost his memory because of the stress he experienced. It was a temporary amnesia caused by the shock. Donald's memory returned eventually, but he was already 15 years old at the time, living a wild life on the street. Charles hugged his brother and couldn't believe his eyes. For so many years, the old man believed that Donald was dead, and now he was standing next to his brother, and together they rejoiced at Charles's salvation. Later, when the survivors of the plane crash returned to civilization, Charles Hall helped his brother move back to the city, where he provided him with housing and all kinds of assistance. Unlike Alfred and Melanie, Jacob visits them almost every week and considers them his friends. After all, only having gone through life's challenges together can one determine who's a real friend and who's not worth their time.